Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sex Sales Podcast, the podcast where we talk about culture, relationships, dating in the modern world from a male and a female perspective. I'm Neil, the comedian, Eliza, the relationship therapist, and today we are talking about male-only spaces. Should they exist? Are they problematic? Should they exist more? What do we think about male-only spaces? I feel like that we're going to disagree on this one a little bit, so it could get nice and juicy. We're going to get into that at the 3-minute mark. Before we do, we're going to talk about our sponsors. We are sponsored by Crush Organics. Crush Organics have an amazing range of CBD oils and CBD products. I use the pain cream every single day. It's helped with my sciatica monumentally. I am almost deadlifting what I was before I had this back issue. So I think a lot of that is due to this pain cream. Honestly, it really does help. So get yourself the Crush Organics CBD pain cream. They also have CBD oils, gummies, all sorts of things. Go to crushorganics.com, crush with a K, and use the code NEIL, N-E-E-L. Yes, that's how you spell my name, not N-E-I-L, N-E-E-L. Far more logical to spell it that way, in fact, not NEIL. And use that code and you'll get 40% off. So crushorganics.com. We're also sponsored by Comedy Untamed. Comedy Untamed runs shows all across the east coast of Australia. Well, soon to be all across the east coast of Australia. We've got a Brisbane show coming soon. But we do weekly shows in Sydney. They've been selling out, so get your tickets. Weekly shows in Melbourne. Monthly in Newcastle. We're doing shows in Geelong. We've got a Wagga Wagga show, of all places, coming up late July. Either that will be on sale now or on sale soon. So if we have any listeners in Wagga Wagga, come along to that. The comedians from Sydney and the comedians from Melbourne are each going to drive 4.5 hours and meet each other and do a mega show. So you get the best of both worlds. Come to that. And there's a big showcase on at the end of the year in Sydney. And that's on November 30th. And this is a huge comedy event. We're trying to change the game of Australian comedy. So comedyuntamed.com, neilkolhacker.com/tickets. That should be on that website as well. So come along to that. And male-only spaces. Ooh. I got some good statistics for you to start on this one, though.
Yes, please.
So I'll articulate those straight out after this. All right, so just before we started this podcast, Eliza said that she's going to get triggered at this podcast. But I said, let me read you these statistics, and then we'll see how you feel. Okay. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm stressed. I don't know why.
According to a study conducted by the YouGov Cambridge Globalism Project in 2019, 24% of American men reported that they had a group of male friends that they just met with regularly. A study published in the journal Gender and Society found that men who participate in male-only groups tend to feel a greater sense of emotional support and camaraderie, and may be more likely to engage in activities that challenge traditional masculine norms. A report from the Australian Human Rights Commission found that men who participate in male-only groups may have a better sense of well-being and be less likely to experience social isolation. Research conducted by the Men's Sheds Association in the UK found that men who participate in male-only spaces tend to have better mental health outcomes, including reduced levels of depression and anxiety. And finally, a study published in the Journal of Men's Studies found that men who participate in male-only groups may be more likely to challenge gender stereotypes and embrace a more flexible and inclusive view of masculinity. So there you go, counterintuitive statistics there to what I assume most people would think about male-only spaces. I am assuming a lot of people, particularly women, particularly younger women, would assume male-only spaces would foment a culture of toxic masculinity and hatred towards women. But those statistics suggest otherwise. So what do you think hearing those statistics?
I mean, I'm already convinced for it in like 20 seconds.
There we go.
I mean,
Podcast over.
See ya. I was always for it. Like, I'm a big advocate for Men's Shed, which is an Australian thing that supports men's mental health, where they basically go to a tool shed and they do man things, but it's not really about that. It's just a place for men to meet and socialize and talk about topics. And I talk about that with my clients a lot when I worked at Lifeline and we're talking to older males. I think my hesitation and concern with this podcast came from hate's a strong word. I get nervous when we talk about topics that can turn into a men versus women thing. And I like the podcast we do where everyone messages me being like, I love that. It was so true and it impacted me so positively. And I hate the podcast when it's so controversial and we're getting ripped in the comments. And I know you like those ones, but it's one of those things where it's, when I looked it up, when you first sent it, the idea a couple of weeks ago, I looked it up, I Googled it like once. And I came across it on Reddit and people were talking about it. And every single comment, this is Reddit, so, whatever. Take that with a grain of salt. But every single comment was basically hating women. Like, feminists have taken everything and women can't allow men to do anything and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, I'm not going into this. But, yeah, I guess there is a lot of importance for it. But there's also a very high need to have women-only spaces as well. So I think the question isn't necessarily like, well, why do women allow? Are they allowed and men aren't? That being said, I don't know what the laws were in Australia. I don't know if you looked it up, but I was seeing that in the US and many states, it's actually illegal to have men-only groups, but it is legal to have women-only spaces, which I thought was interesting. I don't know what the laws are in Australia around that, but yeah, I didn't know that. I did not know that. Aside from jail, of course, that's a men's only space and women's only space. Country clubs, though, there's a lot of men's country clubs. That's one.
There's still a lot of sex segregated schools.
Yeah. Freemasons.
Yeah.
I don't know much about it, but I know that's all men. Barbershops, I don't know if they're fully, obviously it's majority, but...
Yeah, there's these situations where it's not like women are excluded from coming into these spaces, but generally men are the ones going into barbershops and women are going into hairdressers, and you get very male-focused conversation in a barbershop, ironically enough. And from what I hear, you get very female-focused conversation in a hairdresser.
Yeah.
So isn't that interesting? I think a lot of this, I would guess a lot of the fear and some of those laws about male-only spaces come from a historical context where these were high-powered professional spaces that denied access to women. But now I think men are asking for spaces where they can just socialize with other men and just have a club or something like that, where they just talk about what they're experiencing in their life. And it's not as though there needs to be a law saying that women are not permitted in this space. But
yeah.
I think a lot of us question why is that considered such a threat?
I looked it up on a feminist Reddit as well. I looked it up on the men's right Reddit, which was the one that was hating on women constantly, and then I looked it up on the feminist Reddit, the same question, which is very convenient for me that it came up on both. And on the feminist one, they were saying, like, there was basically all the women were saying, I'm not necessarily against it, it's just that I believe it's historically been a cesspool for misogyny and sexism, and congregating and talking about violence against women or derogatory about women in the same sense of a way that, for example, maybe men on a construction site may talk in an offensive manner about women. But then again, wouldn't you rather that be done privately rather than out in the open? So I don't know, it's a hard thing. But I think you're right in that the historical context needs to be taken into place, that, men previously or historically had exclusive power in both their private and public life, and they controlled the environment and the way in which space was designed and who could attend it usually. And in many countries and places, women weren't allowed to be, they had to be escorted by a male. And then that's still that way in some places. And I think that another thing that we need to take into consideration, which doesn't take away from the fact that men-only spaces perhaps do need to exist, but the reason why women-only spaces exist, a lot of that comes down to actually just safety from men, or safety from perceived harassment, whether or not, and that's what I knew would be the kind of controversial aspect of this podcast, is people denying that or saying not all men and things like that. Of course, and I don't know if I ever even said this, but my back injury, I don't know if I said it on this podcast, so my back injury when I was assaulted actually came from an extremely large, heavy woman and not a man. And a lot of people think it was a man that assaulted me, but it was a woman. And yet I still have no fear around being around women, even though that was the thing that put me in a hospital. It's still men that concern me. And like I said last week, I signed up at a podcast. I signed up at a gym.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is, that even though a woman was the person who assaulted you, you don't have any fear?
Because it was the one and only time in my life I have ever been assaulted by a woman, and I can't even count on, I've lost fingers on how many times I've been physically assaulted, or at least verbally or sexually harassed by men. I would say it's been hundreds. And I also know the history of this woman was that she was on ice when she attacked me, and it made her very strong and very aggressive. And it's not so common that I walk past people on ice every day or interact with them. And also based on the profession that I do, being in, working with families and things like that, I knew that was a trigger. So there was all these kind of contextual things, and it's really interesting to me because I reflect on this a lot, actually. I was thinking about this yesterday, that event that occurred to me, I have no trauma from that at all. I have trauma from the pain that I went through and I experienced from the year, and I still get really scared when I think about the pain I was in. But the actual event, even though I was in hospital, I had a broken rib, my back was fucked for a whole year, I still don't hold that much trauma from that. And I know people that witnessed it. Someone was telling me recently still seeks a therapist because they only witnessed it. But it's really interesting. And when I signed up at this gym and this guy was doing this walk around for me, and he kept talking, and then at the very end, he was like, do you have any questions? And I said, the reason I went to this gym was because it's a 24-hour gym, and I like to, if I go to the gym, historically, I like to go in the late evening, 9 or 10 o'clock, and especially now, since having a baby, that's basically going to be the only time that works for me. So when he said, do you have any questions? The only question I asked was what safety protocols do you have in place if I'm coming in here on unstaffed hours? Do you have a duress alarm or something? Because sometimes they have a little ribbon that you can put around your neck with a button on it in case something were to occur. And then I was asking him, are there security cameras because you have to get a lift up from a car park, walk down these corridors in order to get in, because it's in a shopping center. After hours, and I was like, are there cameras there? And this guy didn't know. He was like, I don't know, I'm so sorry, I don't know if we have those things. So he went and got the manager of the gym, and the manager came up to me and was like, yeah, this is the duress alarm, we do have those, and yes, there's cameras everywhere, the entire place is surrounded, blah, blah, blah. But it's just one of those things that I thought was really interesting, that this man that worked there didn't even know about it and hadn't had to kind of consider it. But those are my immediate questions when I'm joining a unisex gym, was what safety measures are in place for me if I come late in the night and I'm concerned. But if that had been a women's only gym, I wouldn't ask those questions. I wouldn't even have considered it. And I looked for a women's only gym as well, but it was too far away from me. So it's just an interesting kind of thing there. And this is why women's only spaces, amongst other reasons, but this is why they exist as well, because 99, or maybe not 99, it's like 96 or whatever, 90-something% of violence and harassment that women are, I guess, that occur to women are usually at the hand of men, particularly straight men. So that's why some places include women and queer people, or women and non-gender conforming people. But yeah, so I don't know, I feel like it's one of those topics that I know, like, men in particular that listen to this are going to get all, like, pissed off in the comments about it. And when I talk about, that assault, people will be like, well, that's hypocritical, and I know that. But it doesn't change the way I feel, and it doesn't change my lived experience and the lived experience of a lot of women as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I don't think... well, if there are men who are saying the reason for a male-only space should be exactly the same as for a woman's only space because of physical danger concerns, then I would argue against that as well. I don't think that's the main reason why there are now calls for male-only spaces. I think most of those calls are coming from men who've studied modern culture, and also a lot of women. There are prominent feminists who are talking about this as well. Mary Harrington is one, and Louise Perry, and I think Camille Paglia talks about it as well, where the dynamic can change in a space of, say, socialization or where activities are occurring when it's either purely male, unisex, or when it's purely female. And we want to kind of avoid that because it's an uncomfortable topic, and we like to think, okay, gender is all very socially constructed, and there are huge elements of gender that are socially constructed, but there are also just the sort of things we talk about where men have different hormonal makeups and physiological differences where the dynamic does change when you're in a space with other women. And that's not to say that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
But sometimes you want a release or just a space where you can actually be yourself.
Yeah.
And so it seems like there's this unfair criticism of those spaces, assuming that, it must be toxic, or it must be where men are developing these horrible ideas about women, when the statistics I read out at the start of this podcast were completely counterintuitive to that narrative. And look, of all the male-only spaces that exist out there in the world, without a doubt there would be some where there are a gathering of men who are talking about how much they resent women. Sure. Yeah. But I don't think it's fair to paint all male spaces with that brush and assume that if there isn't any female presence in a space at any given time, men are just going to simply, back each other up on how much they hate women. I think, first of all, that's quite I find that kind of offensive, to assume that if I'm just there with my male friends, all we're talking about is how amazing Andrew Tate is or something like that. That's just ridiculous.
Exactly.
And so people who have that opinion, I wonder what they've maybe experienced in their life, or if they need to sort of broaden their perspective a little bit, because that's just not true. And that I'd be lying if I say there aren't times when I'm just with my male friends when I feel a bit more comfortable and we communicate in a very different way. We're more ideas focused, and look, the jokes are different. There's a different threshold of what we deem appropriate, and that can be threatening to people. And look, taken to the extreme, that can obviously be quite bad. But to deny any ability for men to just kind of develop their own culture within a space that isn't completely different from what is expected of them in the mainstream or what is sort of normalized in mainstream unisex environments.
Yeah.
Under the assumption that it will always be dangerous or it could be toxic, it's unfair. I can't see how that's a fair way to just think about men, because it's saying that men just inherently have this hatred towards women, and as soon as you let them organize in a group where there's just them, they're just going to ferment those attitudes and just amplify them. Which
the thing is, though,
is just wrong.
I agree 100%. I agree with everything you said, but I also think that we have to be conscious of when we're saying we're preventing it. And not that you were saying this, but I don't want people to interpret it like all women are preventing men from having men-only spaces.
Sure.
Because that's absolutely not the case. And when I talked about that woman on that feminist Reddit, that was one reply from one woman. So it's not the whole view of women at all. And this is which I'm glad we're actually talking about this, because the more we talk about it, the more I'm like, this is actually an important conversation to be had. But the reason I was hesitant about it, because I was so like, I don't want this to become a woman blaming thing, which it's not. But that's what I feel like people can interpret it as. And I didn't do much research on it except for like 2 minutes before this podcast started. And I was looking at how, like, well, what men-only spaces are there? And there are a few, but there is way more women spaces. Like, women have women-only spaces at universities, women-only clubs, women-only gyms. Anyway, there's countless things. And even women-only workspaces as well, like hubs where you can do your work from home kind of hubs. And I think that it is interesting, and it makes sense to me why there are women-only spaces. It doesn't make sense to me why there aren't necessarily men's-only spaces, and that was what I tried to look up for like 5 minutes before. And what I found, aside from there being apparent, which I didn't fact-check this, laws in the US, some states in the US that say that it's just discriminatory to have only male-only spaces that deny access to women, I also found that there were gym chains created in the US, for example, that were men only, but just it never lifted. Like, no one cared enough to go to it and it was interpreted that it wasn't as important to men to have, just for the space of gym, to have a male-only gym space. They didn't kind of care about that enough to have it. So maybe it may not necessarily be that people are preventing it. It may be that it's just not enough. No one has created enough, and maybe there are hesitations from men to be like, I don't want to create these clubs or spaces because I don't want it to be perceived as being misogynistic or a cesspool for sexism, like someone had written earlier that I mentioned before. And you don't want people to feel embarrassed or shamed to say, I'm going to a men's only club, because you're right. The conversations that you have within your own gender can be so different to when there's outside influence. And I was thinking when you said that, when I lived with my previous housemate before I met Adrian, I lived with this guy, and he's a little bit more conservative than me, bless him. And every time I had the girls over, we'd be talking about sex, we'd be talking about the guys we're dating, we'd be talking about all these details. And he would say to me, like, I hate the conversations you have. I hate overhearing them. I hate the way you talk about the men. And I'm like, wait, we don't say anything bad about guys. And he's like, you're talking about this guy's genitals, you're talking about this. And I was like, but they're strangers. And it's, there's women are doing it too. And then after that, he said that, he kind of called me out on it. And I was like, I didn't say anything. He was like, oh, it's not so much you, it's more the other girls. But I think he was just saying that to protect me, because I know I talk about sex and relationships probably more than anyone. I literally do that as a living. But after that, I consistently was, every time I had friends over, even when he was in his bedroom, I was so conscious of asking my friends, like, oh, who are you dating? How how was it? What happened? I'd like whisper it because I didn't want him to overhear it. And then I'd try to like, if my friend was getting really passionate, I'd try to steer the conversation away. And one time we were talking about sex toys and he walked past and he got really uncomfortable. And yeah, that he was an influencing factor, and there was no factor of feeling unsafe there. He was probably one of the males I felt the most safest around. But it was just the different dynamic of what can be talked about within different groups. And it's the exact same like what you were saying. Men need a safer space to talk, and not necessarily that women pose a threat to that, but it does change the dynamic completely. And you want to be able to kind of speak freely without someone interjecting, or you may, and like you said with that study where it said it actually is beneficial in the sense that it's more likely to challenge gender stereotypes, because if there was someone in a men's only group saying something that's, say, misogynistic and sexist, and a woman overhears it and calls it out, the chances of her convincing him of that's misogynistic and sexist, if he's a misogynistic person, is unlikely that she's going to influence him. But if another man challenges that and says, hey man, like actually that's not true or something, he's way more likely to come around the other way. It's way more beneficial in the same way that it probably is for women as well, when they say things like, I'm sure there are groups of women where they meet up and say men are trash. So there you go.
Those girls groups on Facebook, some of those screenshots get leaked, and a lot of men are.
I'm in one of those groups.
At what they see. I mean, I saw one where it was
brutal.
A girl talking about how she broke a man's phone and then gaslit him, and just did all sorts of crazy things. And another woman actually screenshotted it and posted it out in public. And yeah, look, as soon as you get these it's sort of what you're seeing on the internet right now, aren't you? Because you're allowing people who otherwise would have just existed within their geographic location and might have had their strange thoughts, but would have been alone in those strange thoughts. What the internet has done is allowed all those people with strange or fringe thoughts to congregate in a big online hub where they can then feel validated in how they're thinking, and then that can get to a very extreme point because they're always constantly validating each other and trying to challenge each other. Whereas if you're in just a work environment of 100 quote-unquote average people, and there's someone there with strange or fringe or radical ideas, those ideas don't really ever get exposed. And you're opening the door for that in male spaces, but I just can't say there's far more benefits that outweigh the cost. But you're also correct in saying, I don't think many women actually are against it. I don't think there are women campaigning to deny men's only spaces. And you're also right in saying that if someone did open a male-only space, look, the sort of people who might be attracted to it initially could be some of the ones who have unsavory ideas about the opposite gender. And if you did something like that and opened a modern male-only club, you'd have to have a very strict code of ethics to deny it, because already there'll be people in society that are thinking, oh, this is just going to be a hub for sexism. And so you'd then have to take a lot of responsibility to say that I'm going to go above and beyond to ensure that doesn't come about. And you're also right in saying there are certain gyms that are branded in a way where, look, only men are going to go to this gym. A hardcore gym is a perfect example. Something like the UFC, you go to watch a UFC fight or a boxing fight. Yeah, there's women there, but it's a very male-dominated just situation. So it's not like men's-only spaces don't exist, but I think more what you were talking about, where there's clubs in university, or there's just sort of organizations that can be for male issues, and that just doesn't seem to be permitted in this day and age yet. Well, I think that might actually be changing, where there's now, I think it was either the UK or the US, a Western country that instated the first minister for men, and it was going to look at issues like boys falling behind in school and all these new issues that seem to be emerging. And the argument would be, look, if you don't allow men's only spaces in the physical world, well, they're just going to find them in the digital world, and that's where you get the most resentful and weird, socially isolated people who congregate in Discord groups that just develop quite unhealthy attitudes. Whereas if there was a men's only club that met every Saturday, where they went to the gym, then they read Stoicism, and then they watched the UFC. I don't know, whatever it might be. But they all just sort of talked amongst each other and, sort of embrace that male-only dynamic. Then I can't see an issue with that. That'll probably help a lot of men if you get them out of the online silos and tell them to actually do things like that. And again, you're just thinking about that. There's nothing actually denying groups of men from doing that. I think some of it just comes from wanting the title of not being culturally shamed for wanting a male only space, and a lot of it just comes from that. The one about so without a doubt, look, women are the ones that experience the vast majority of domestic violence here. But then what happens when you have these women-only shelters is that when men do experience domestic violence, which they do, there's no haven for them. They can't go anywhere. Yeah. And that's something I found a lot on online forums. Now, a lot of this is anecdotal. I don't know. I haven't really researched this in depth, but it's a common complaint that comes up from men saying, I experienced physical abuse from a female partner, and I couldn't go to the domestic shelters, obviously because the ones there were often women only. And then the police didn't necessarily take it that seriously, and I didn't really have anywhere to go. So there was, I think it was either Canada or the UK, where they tried to bring in a male or a unisex domestic violence shelter, but they didn't let them do it. It was seen as, it was sort of seen as limiting the ability for women to have the safe space that they needed. So that's one where I just can't see how that, something like that in a big city, there should probably be one. If there are a lot of shelters that are women only, that there should be one for men.
It's definitely an issue. And even in Australia, when I was younger, I worked with homeless youth, like young people, 12 to 21, that were homeless. And they basically, the way it worked is they would have an up to 2-year lease with an apartment or something that the government would provide to us that I would support them in. And then if they still didn't have accommodation, they would go to a different organization. Or if they weren't at the point where they could live independently, they would go into a crisis refuge, which is a 3-month support for any young person. And if the 3 months have passed and there's nowhere we can place them, they have to go into another refuge with another organization. And basically, I found that when I had boys on my caseload, finding places that would take boys in, especially to a refuge, because it's more like a lot more chaos occurs there, they'd be like, we're full. And then I call up later that day and be like, I've got a 16-year-old girl. Yeah, we can take her. Which was really frustrating for me at that point. It was beyond frustrating. Yeah. And you could spend 9 months, I literally did spend 9 months trying to find a place for one boy, and no one would take him because he had a history of violence, yet they would take 12 of the girls I had in the same places. So it definitely occurs, and it's really sad because it's like, well, what support systems are in place for our men, let alone our young men and young people, to help them? There's interventions in school, which I think that is one area that's done really well, and probably equally across the board is supports and information and resource sharing within schools. But what happens when you're past the point of preventing and you need an immediate response and action? Yes, there's, like, if you look it up, if you go to, like, there's a website called Link to Home, and you can find 60 different refuges in Sydney or whatever that they could possibly go to, and it seems like there's a million resources, but it still comes down to that person or the bosses or the refuge leaders' personal opinion on what they think, because they have to take into account the personal dynamics and the safety of everyone. So there's prejudice there and assumptions and discrimination as well. So, and you're right, with domestic violence and even homeless shelters for all homeless people, that often, I know in some places it's first in best dress, like you line up and you go in and you have a place for the night, but when you're applying for something, it can be different. However, I do believe, I haven't had so much experience working in public housing. I have had a little bit, but I do believe at least in public housing, it's pretty across the board there in providing housing to men and women equally. But there's a 10-year wait list just for like the priority list, basically. So if you're homeless, you're waiting at least 10, 20 years for a house eventually.
Yeah,
there's no
a tough
immediate solution. Yeah,
because if you're trying to house someone that has come from a broken home and you know that they're likely to be violent, well, you do know the man is probably more likely to be violent than the woman, and so you're just sort of playing the statistics there and think, all right, I've got a shelter here with 5 women, and here's a guy that probably doesn't need the help, but if he has a history of violence himself, well, what are you going to do? You got to kind of look out for the women there. But then, if anything, that actually promotes the idea of a male-only shelter, because then you don't have to worry about the safety of the women who are already in that shelter. You have, I mean, you got to. If it's a violent person, the men should still be. The men in there also need protection. It's there's also big size dynamics between men, and I can say as a smaller guy, like, you know, if I'm in a room with a bunch of big dudes that look a bit scary, like, I also feel, not that I feel unsafe necessarily, but I know if anything ever happened,
you're more
I don't have a chance to fight back at this point. So
there are a lot more boy group homes than there are girl group homes, but I would say a boy group home is the last place on earth any kid should be in. I would, if I was a 13-year-old boy, knowing what I know now, I'd rather be living on the streets than be in a boys group home. Like, it's just the most horrific place to be. And I've worked in them as well. It's just like devastatingly sad and violent and abusive. It's crazy. That's why you see that shit on A Current Affair all the time. And it's not necessarily just because of the workers. It's just like so much testosterone, hormones, puberty, maxed with trauma, violent behaviors. It's a recipe for disaster. So they try to, it's safer to have boys live independently where possible, but then that's not always possible. There's not always places available. So it's so hard. It's so sad, because working in my job in foster care, if a boy lost his placement, I would do literally anything to avoid him going into a group home. I paid, not me personally, but like $500,000 a year to keep a kid living in a hotel with workers rather than putting him in a group home, even though, you know, government was like, he needs to go in a home. I was like, no way, like over my dead body kind of thing, anything to avoid it. But then it's like, well, that's taxpayers' money. It's so convoluted and there's so many issues with it. But I feel like the amount of, and it just speaks to the amount of support and intervention that does go into group homes. It's, at some points, it's the most, it's extremely expensive. There's hundreds of thousands of dollars of government programs to try to support those, but it's just not effective. And I know that the stats of kids that end up in a group home, their outcome in life is far more likely to be met with early death, suicide, severe mental health, criminal activity, no education, unemployment, poverty, compared to basically anywhere else. So it's really sad. It's devastating. And then I worked in girls' homes, and which was really sad in the sense that they had endured a severe abuse. Like, I worked with girls that were in forced marriages and things like that, and homes for that. But by the end of the year, these girls, I was getting them scholarships, I was getting them to university, and like all these amazing opportunities were able to come up much more for the girls than what would come for the boys, unfortunately.
That reminds me of that. It's a really good book, Of Boys and Men. It just came out last year. Richard Reeves, and he's sort of done a few of the talk shows in America, and because you think anyone who writes a book about boys and men and the issues they face, a lot of people will have an immediate reaction of dismissal. But a lot of people who would otherwise be very progressive have really found a lot of wisdom in this book and found it quite interesting. So I'd recommend anyone read that book. And he talks about how boys are actually heavily influenced by the environment a lot more than girls, which sort of links to what you were talking about, where a girl could grow up in a relatively abusive household, but then with the right within another 2 years in a positive environment, they can sometimes have much better outcomes than a boy who, even if he spent just 2 or 3 years in a terrible environment, then it's almost like he's consigned to a life of really low socioeconomic behaviors and environments, and it's really unfortunate. And he was saying that there's a space for male-only socialization environments where, sometimes men can actually discipline boys in a way that is a bit more effective and lead them on the path, because they know what it has been like being a boy and having all that testosterone and having gone through puberty and just being more horny than you can imagine and unable to focus, and how to actually integrate that into something constructive and beneficial for society. And that's not to say women can't raise boys at all, but just because of having had the lived experience of being a boy, it gives you a bit more insight into, on average, into raising another boy. And when now we're seeing a lot more, education is very female, and care industries are very female, as you would know, and there's a lot more single mothers, and there's just less positive male influences in many young boys' life, especially in lower socioeconomic areas. And so they look up, who do they see that is inspiring and emulates masculine ideals and can climb social hierarchies? Gangster rappers, people like Andrew Tate, superheroes, just these sort of either childish or unhealthy heroic figures that they're looking up to and emulating the characteristics of. And there's a space, there's a very strong argument to be said about male spaces, particularly for young boys, where they interact with older men who are just, they don't have to be incredible men by any means, but just socially healthy, productive, constructive members of society.
This is a really big thing in Indigenous communities. There's men's group, women's group, or I think they call it women's work and men's work. I might be wrong with that phrasing, but something similar, sorry. But it's very, very common that men or boys will be grouped with men and elders within the community who teach them ways, or they might do a trip, or they go back home or back to bush or something, and we would see that a lot at work, and it was so powerful and so amazing. And like you said, to look at someone that can inspire you. And I think that what happens a lot when people have endured trauma, and this is a little bit of armchair psychology, it's a lot more in depth than the way I'm about to summarize it, but who you are when you've endured trauma as a child, who you are as an unhealed adult, like if you haven't gone to therapy, you haven't done all this work, who you are as an adult is exactly who you needed to be or who you wanted to be when you were that child being abused. So when I'm talking about these girls that have become, successful and they're getting university scholarships and all these things, when they were enduring abuse, they dreamt of being a girl or being a woman that was empowered, making her own decisions, being free, independent, etc. And boys were, when they were being abused, have become men that are strong, can hold their own, can fight, can survive, are tough. And that's what they had needed when they were kids. And like I said, that's very armchair psychology. There's a lot more to it, but it's so true. And when I see people and I meet people and I work with people that have these tendencies or are really, a little bit unhinged or violent or aggressive, I just think this person is protecting their inner child, and that's what they would have needed, and that's what they wanted when they were a kid. So it's a good perspective to have on people when you meet them and see, I understand you more now.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. And
so not necessarily just about the influences. Although, I don't know if I just saw the other day that they've banned rap music at the Easter show, like hip hop music. And I thought of you immediately because I know you kind of always talk about how like rap does have an influence on youth. And it's so funny because before I saw this article, I was talking about this with Adrian in the car. We were listening to hip hop or something. I don't know. I don't know why that sounds so cringe. We were listening to hip hop. But we were, and in front of Remy, and he's a baby, he doesn't understand anything yet. But I was saying like how you talk about how it influences youth, and I was like, it's so funny because I never acknowledged that at all, and I listened to this religiously when I was a kid. I knew all the words, but I didn't know any of the meaning. But now they've banned it, and they were saying, last year there was a fatal stabbing. I think it was fatal. Like there was all this
the
gang
postcode wars,
and they were saying that they believe it was influenced heavily by the rap music, and that was playing at the Easter show and pumping people up. And I was like, part of me is just like, that's just what, like crazy. But I guess it does make sense in some ways. But I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it. But I just kept hearing your words ring through my mind.
Yeah, I have a very I have mixed opinions about hip hop because I love it. I love hip hop music, and my whole playlist at the gym is some of the most aggressive hip hop I could find. And it really does tap into these sort of animalistic urges that I have, and it articulates them in a way that's artistically compelling and fun and lively and boorish and exciting, but at the same time, I know how influential the values are in a lot of gangster rap and drill rap, and I can't see how that's good for a boy who's growing up in a low socioeconomic environment out in Western Sydney or wherever he might be. But banning it is not the solution either. It just means there needs to be better alternatives for him. There needs to be better heroes for him. And if there aren't better heroes, of course you're going to look up to someone who's a multimillionaire, king of the castle. In many ways, and look, these are the poets of that ilk of society. These are the poets of the hood. They are the artistic, creative people of the hood. So look, if they have other creative outlets, if they have better role models, and they have opportunities that mean they don't have to pursue a life of gang activity, well, that seems to be more of the solution. A better cultural message rather than shaming them for one cultural message.
Yeah.
And I just don't know what that cultural message is, though, because, I mean, I'm going to be honest. I looked at that Four Corners episode on the postcode wars, and the way some of those guys were talking about the gang lifestyle and the brotherhood and the camaraderie and how they're willing to die for each other, part of me was drawn to it
Yeah.
because I think men have an intrinsic urge to be in a brotherhood, and there is that quote. What is
tribe.
it? It's if a man doesn't have something to die for, he has nothing to live for. If a man doesn't have a wife or children that he's willing to die for, if he doesn't have a cause that he's willing to die for, he's got nothing to live for. And then I think that's really true. And that's what
That's
these
so
gangs give
interesting.
people. They give them something to die for. And
Wow.
yeah,
That is
it
powerful.
really was confusing because there was a little part of me that I think I had more of when I was a kid that was drawn to it and thought this
Yeah.
is so compelling to be part of
Yeah.
this kind of ruthless brotherhood that's trying to gain territory and
Yeah.
be top of be king of the castle, king of the culture, king of the location. And I think that's just part of our physiological makeup as men. Now the issue is you got to try to integrate that into something constructive, and it's
Yeah.
hard to
And
do that
what?
because now we're moving to a society where things that men have an inherent advantage in, namely physical strength and object style learning. That's just less. There's less demand for that. Automation is gonna. It's already over the 20th century has taken a lot of those kind of jobs, and now, if anything, there's a much more demand for things that women have an inherent advantage in, such as care professions and
Yeah.
emotional intelligence. And so, this trend of women out earning men is probably just gonna up to the age of 35, I think, and women just generally doing better and having more social status on average. It's probably going to continue. And this might be even the first time in history where and that's not to say that women have
Yeah. Yeah.
a societal advantage in every area of life by any means, but professionally we might be getting to that point. We're not there yet, but looking at the trends and just thinking about the areas that are going to require a lot of more demand of in the future. I just don't see how a guy who's born with these urges to be part of a tribe and be violent and strive for something really really dominant, or live that kind of stereotypically male animalistic life. I just can't see how we can integrate that into a world where there's no more physical jobs, or there's no more jobs that require any kind of semblance of those skills. And I think
I
there just
think
has to be a new roadmap for how to get the best out of men. And I think male-only spaces play a part in that.
I think so as well. And I also think that, like you said before, that there is a much greater importance does need to be put on male role models. And when you think about this Andrew Tate following, you can see the appeal initially is he's a dominant, successful, rich man who does well with the ladies, and everything he says is a crock of shit. But also, what's the alternative? What other male is out there with that level of success that is speaking to the youth, saying, here's what you need to do, and has that kind of like encouragement and camaraderie aspect? And then, like, yeah, there's people like Logan Paul and Jake Paul who are also kind of
And they're very
shits,
popular.
but
Yeah.
they're so popular. And imagine the power that they have or could have if they were talking about things like mental health. Like, you know how they released that drink? What's it called? I don't know.
Prime.
They're Prime. And there's videos of thousands of kids flocking the shelves to get this fucking
very popular.
soft drink or energy drink because it was made by like Logan Paul. And the one, I've never liked Logan Paul or Jake Paul for obvious reasons, except for the one time where I liked when they used their platform to call out Andrew Tate. And so many of their followers were conflicted because they liked Andrew Paul. It says Andrew Tate, and they also liked Logan Paul. And then Logan Paul was like, what Andrew Tate is saying is misogynistic. And then all the followers are so confused about whose side to take. So I thought it was effective in that way. But there needs to be more like influences of that level speaking to these boys and saying things like being cool as well and being successful, but also putting out messages that are healthy and probably helpful and inspirational in a better way.
Yeah, it's hard though, because when you're a teenage boy, you're inherently rebellious, and then the evolutionary psychology theory from this is that as you're moving towards your teenage years, you're toying with your autonomy. And so, as anyone who has teenage children would know, but particularly male teenage children, they're a nightmare. They don't listen to anything, and they just will always rebel and do whatever they're supposed to not do. And so then it becomes very counterintuitive to try to inspire guys of that age. Look, when guys get to their mid-20s, they're often a lot more receptive to those sorts of ideas. But as a teenager, it's difficult. And
well, not if they have an extremely high level of respect for someone, like, for example, a sports idol. Or in my work, I can't say his name, but there was someone who was an ex-pro. I'll just say like he was a fighter of some kind. Get the idea, like Muay Thai or boxing or something equivalent to that. And all the kids knew who he was, and we paid him to be a mentor, very expensive mentor, to some of our most disadvantaged and violent boys, where he would teach them boxing and fighting skills, but life lessons alongside it, in the same way that, Taekwondo, it's all about defense and respect, and there's a lot of like rule there. So even though I wouldn't put these boys I work with in Taekwondo, because they wouldn't respond well, but when they had this guy in front of him that was super cool, won all his fights, he was violent, successful, handsome or whatever, and telling them, like, he'd always be like, boy, you gotta say thank you to Eliza. This is what you do. This is how you speak to a woman. This is how you do this. All these life lessons combined with the knowing that this guy is a total badass and could beat up anyone on the street, I thought was really effective, in the same way that sports stars have that potential and do have that influence at times as well. So I do think there is possibility there. Like, they're not going to rebel against every guy that speaks positively, but it's the mass like influence that peers have on one another, the same way that girls, it's the same for guys. When everyone is drawn to someone, it absolutely has a huge influence. So if everyone is talking about Andrew Tate, boys are going to get drawn to that and curious about that. And when the more you consume it, the more you can convince yourself of something.
Yeah.
Especially to an immature brain.
Sure, and he was just actually doing a multi-level marketing scheme at the end of the day.
Yeah.
However, because there's a dearth of just sort of positive masculinity, that then they gravitate towards the toxic kind. The thing with a lot of those boys will like fighters and NRL players, or rappers. And the thing is, though, you want to try to convince a lot of young boys and younger men that you don't need to be a multimillionaire. You don't need to be the best fighter in the world or the top NRL player. You just need to have a good job and be a productive and constructive member of society. And that is now seen as selling out or being in the matrix, or just not as compelling as it used to be. And what it used to be, even just in the post-war period, was that, hey, you don't have to be the most famous person out there, but if you have a good job, you'll be able to buy a house, you'll have a wife that loves you, you'll have children, and you'll just live a humble but respectable life. Now, obviously, that denied a lot of women the ability to have a career. And so now that a lot of women have a career and are making their own money, I don't think a lot of men are necessarily resentful about that, but a lot of men actually like the idea of being the provider and like the idea of providing for someone that they love and for their children. And now that it's more equitable, and for many younger people, the woman is often the major breadwinner, there isn't that sense of I'm needed. I have this responsibility and this duty because I'm my family depends upon me, and so society has to find a way to allow men to feel needed again, whilst still maintaining all the autonomy and career gains that women have made. And that's a pretty tough question. That's a pretty hard thing to do. I would suggest that so a lot of these things you're talking about, right, the positive role model and things like that, that should really come from the father. A good father should provide that for their son, and then they won't need to look up to whatever gangster rappers or I don't know, postcode guys or Andrew Tate. Or even Jordan Peterson. So Jordan Peterson probably appeals more to the sort of intellectually inclined lost men, and I'd be lying if I say he's spoken to me. I love the vast majority of his message, and I think he's very compelling. And he doesn't shame men. He doesn't say, you're not reaching the bare minimum. You're not, you're problematic. He says, hey, look, you can be something amazing, but you got to get your act together. And it's a far more compelling message compared to what a lot of the rest of society is saying, which is that, you're either inherently problematic or you're not living up to the bare minimum, which just makes men shut down more because they think, well, I'm just being shamed, so I don't want to do anything. So there's that. I think if you have a more positive, less shame-focused, rather than focusing on what the negatives of men today, focusing on what they could be and what they're capable of. And I think Jordan Peterson does that quite well, and some of those male gurus do it well. And again, I think that's just another argument for healthy and positive male-only spaces. And it wasn't that long ago when it was the father that did. And for most people, their father still does this role where they take them out and whatever, go fishing with them, or just do sort of stereotypically male activities, and that's when you do that's when you're taught the wisdom and lessons about life and how to treat. So what you were talking about there, where he's coming in saying like, this is how you talk to a woman, this is how you treat a woman. Well, like, I think a lot of men are unsure about that now, because there's one school of thought that says, well, we should treat everyone the same, and doesn't matter that she's a woman, you shouldn't treat her any differently to a man. But then there's the other school of thought which is saying, no, like, we should be more empathetic, or there should be just a different way that we interact with the women in our life compared to the men in our life. So there's still this sort of confusing idea of, if you are a father or if you are a man that's responsible for someone who might be influential, you don't even know what to say.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Or
it makes sense. Yeah, it's really hard, and I think that, I mean, to touch on what you said at the beginning of that, I kind of disagree I agree in the sense that men need a purpose, 1,000%. I don't agree, not that you were saying this, but I don't agree with the idea that it's because women are more successful that it's not happening as much, because this is anecdotally speaking, but I've dated a lot of men, and I've never ever had a man tell me he wants to be a provider for me, or he would look after me if I had kids, or any of that. And I also know the exact same for my friends. Now that we're all at the age of having babies, or having had babies, or thinking about babies, a lot of my friends are coming up with this issue as well, when the guy is like, well, how long am I expected to pay for you, or when are you going to go back to work? And then, well, should I be having a baby now if I can't afford to take more than a year or two off? If I could only afford 4 months off, should I be doing that? Like, I actually find that men are more likely to not want to be the providers these days, at least in Australia, because it's so hard with inflation. Yeah. It's like, maybe if we were in a time and place where it was doable, people would have a different school of thought. But I definitely am seeing that come up a lot more now, where I even saw like a video of go viral of a woman saying it's like anti-feminist to be allowing men to split the bills with men. She's like, if you're a feminist, you should be letting a man pay for you because of what men have done historically to women, and also because of pink tax and how much money I spent on my makeup per year and my hygiene products and my clothes, like all these things in order to be appealing towards a man. He at very least should pay. There's definitely, like you said, there's two schools of thoughts about how to speak to a woman. There's schools of thoughts about who should be the provider and how to be the provider. There's schools of thoughts on what's feminist and what's not feminist and all these things. It is like a really grey, complex kind of issue. But I guess to put it in a nutshell, I think a positive male influence that comes from your father is really important, but what's even more important, at least when it comes to relationships, is being able to witness and being surrounded, not necessarily having to be your own parents if they're divorced or whatever. Being in the presence of healthy relationships is so essential. And I say that to Adrian all the time, that Remy is going to be looking at us and how we interact with one another and show affection and love or discuss things, and that is going to be his inherent blueprint for what he takes out into the world when he's a teenager and he's a boy as well. And he's not going to be so much as copying the way that I am, but he'll be more likely to be copying the way that Adrian is in the way that he interacts with his peers and his lovers, or I guess lover,
sure,
me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it is really important, and there is a big issue with an absence of that male figure, and the same way that women had that, there's the absence of a missed figure, and the same way as well that if it was a man without a mother figure in his life, or that feminine nurturing aspect in his life, it can be at a huge deficit, in the same way that women that don't have a father figure in their life is going to be impacted as well. So, I mean, in this day and age, you're less likely to have a nuclear family with your mum and dad together, married, in a healthy, stable relationship. It's almost, you're more likely to have divorced parents almost nowadays. And of course, there's death, and then there's violence, and there's, a million things, work taking you away. There's so many factors there that it's impossible to say this is the recipe to make a healthy and good child. It really comes down to, I'm about to say the recipes, contradictory, but I think it really comes down to the network, or in my work, like the therapeutic way of saying it would be like the circle of security, like who is around this kid influencing them. If it's not mum and dad, what school teachers are there? What other trusted adults are there? What peers are there? All the things that surround a child are what is going to be influence. And my friend from Mother's Group, who's a teacher, she always says like minds attract like minds. And she said, kids that have similar upbringing experiences, and I see this in my work as well, they flock together. And then it can be challenging because they then don't experience anything that challenges that. So they don't get to witness something like a healthy relationship or a healthy communication method if every single person in their peer group has dismissive, avoidant attachment styles or something like that. So yeah, it's so complex.
So the social structures that have continuously been degraded over the last century, basically, and we've all been liberated from those social structures because some of those weren't in line with the ethics of the time. But now that there's an absence of those social structures, the next generations are going to continue to pay those costs, and we're all individualistic and atomized, and there's less community, there's less extended family, and for some people there's less family. There's two overworked parents, and due to economic concerns, they have to do that.
Yeah.
That have no time for the children, and then they're on social media all the time. I think I did read a statistic the other day that said children who have a worse home life are far more likely to spend time on social media. And then there's this sort of exponential graph of the amount of time you spend on social media. Is the people who tend to spend more time on social media spend a lot more time on social media, and they're also more vocal on social media. So there are issues, and it's cultural, it's economic, it's a lot of things, isn't it? And I do think, coming back to the sort of springboard of this topic was male-only spaces. I think there is a role for healthy and positive male-only spaces in the years to come for younger boys, but also for older men who mightn't have had those positive male influences, and then can experience that from a community, a like-minded community. And like you also fairly pointed out, there's nothing really preventing that per se. So it's on us, it's on men to actually start to develop those spaces and move forward with them and commit to them. And it's easier said than done, but I think it will be done in the coming years. And I think there is a need for it.
Yeah. And don't forget, if you are a man thinking, shit, I need this, don't forget that Australian Men's Shed Association, which is literally what this is for. It's where men just congregate in an area. They work on, they say, a meaningful project together, where it's basically just a way to have deep conversations, but you're not actually looking at someone, you're building something or doing something, you're distracted by something, and you're just sharing a space together. So they're all around Australia as well.
Yeah, so they do already exist, so maybe it's a superfluous conversation. And, I think, it's important to look at the context of everything, like we talked about in the last podcast as well. If there are people listening that think, oh, look, the male-only space would just result in toxic attitudes, I would strongly compel them to think about that narrative and
listen to the podcast again.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening, and make sure you subscribe. You follow us on Instagram, on TikTok, and you share this podcast with anyone who you think it might be beneficial for. Read that book, Of Boys and Men. I cannot recommend that book enough. It is from a left-leaning person. It's not a Andrew Tate-like figure in any way, shape, or form. I think he has a whole chapter criticizing those sorts of people. Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. I really strongly recommend that book. Otherwise, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you next week.